In a small town called Graysville, nestled among dense forests and dark ravines, there were rumors of a creepy creature that appeared every full moon. The locals whispered that it was a werewolf that hunted those who dared to go outside their homes after sunset. The protagonist of the story, Jacob Sanders, was a young and curious man. He was always skeptical of rumors and myths. One day, as the full moon was approaching, he decided to see if all those werewolf stories were true. His friend Thomas tried to talk him out of it, saying it was better not to test fate, but Jacob was undeterred. At night, when the moon shone brighter than ever, Jacob left his house and headed into the woods. He could feel the darkness thickening around him, and the cold wind whispered in his ear. Every rustle and every sound made his heart beat faster, but he kept walking forward, determined to find the truth. A few hours passed, and Jacob came upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for centuries, and tree branches wrapped around it as if trying to hide it from view. He stepped closer, and his heart raced when he noticed the door was ajar. Someone must be here, Jacob thought, and stepped inside. It was dark and damp inside the cabin. He turned on the flashlight, and its beam of light fell on the walls, which were covered with strange drawings and symbols. They depicted people with animal faces, and Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a low, growling sound coming from the basement. Jacob, overflowing with adrenaline, couldn't resist the temptation to find out what it was. He walked slowly down the creaky steps, his heart quickening with each step. When he reached the basement, the beam of his flashlight illuminated a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, but his body was covered in stiff fur, and his eyes glittered like a wild animal's. Jacob realized it was a werewolf standing before him, and in that moment his fear reached a climax. "You shouldn't have come here," the beast said, its voice low and threatening. "You're mine now!" Jacob tried to run, but the werewolf was faster. He grabbed his arm and pulled him to him. At that moment, Jacob saw the moon reflected in the monster's eyes, and he remembered all the stories he'd ever heard about him. He remembered how people disappeared in Graysville, and how they were never found again. "Please let me go," he screamed, but the beast only grinned, showing sharp teeth. He began to approach, and Jacob felt his legs grow heavy with fear. But suddenly, at the last moment, Jacob remembered an old legend the locals had told him. They said that a werewolf could be defeated if it was made to remember its humanity. He shouted, "You were human! You don't have to be this monster!" Jacob's words seemed to hurt the beast. The werewolf stopped, and his eyes went blank for a moment. Jacob could see the two entities inside him struggling, beast and man. He continued to speak, trying to reach the remaining human feelings in him. "You can choose to be what you want to be! You don't have to be a beast!" he shouted. At that moment, when it looked like the beast was about to attack again, it suddenly stopped and wailed. Jacob saw the rough skin begin to slowly disappear, and in its place was a man, Michael, a local man who had disappeared a few months ago. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice full of fear and pain. "I've been trapped in this body for too long." Jacob, unable to believe his eyes, helped Michael to his feet, and together they ran out of the cabin. As the sun disappeared over the horizon on Saturday night, Jason Willis headed home along the dark forest path. He was in a hurry to get home before darkness fell, because there were terrible rumors of a terrible werewolf terrorizing the area. Suddenly Jason heard a strange sound, like a growl. He froze in place, staring into the darkness. His heart was pounding furiously, and goosebumps ran up and down his spine. Jason strained his vision, trying to see anything in the thick forest gloom, but there was nothing to be seen. Suddenly a huge shadow appeared from behind the trees. Jason froze with horror. It was a monster. It moved on four legs like a huge wolf, but its size was monstrous. Its eyes glowed a terrible red light, and long, sharp fangs dangled from its mouth. Jason backed away, but the monster was coming closer and closer. He tried to run, but his legs felt like lead, and he could barely move for fear. The werewolf let out a blood-curdling howl and leaped at Jason. The young man squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for his imminent death. He felt the sharp claws digging into his flesh and the beast's hot breath burning his skin. Jason braced himself for a horrible death. But instead, suddenly, everything went silent. When Jason opened his eyes, he found that the werewolf was gone. He looked around, but there was nothing but silence. There was only a light wind rustling through the trees. His body shook and Jason hurried home. He could barely move his legs, still reeling from the horrible encounter with the werewolf. When he got home, he collapsed on the bed, trying to catch his breath. But the nightmare was just beginning. That night Jason had a terrible dream. He was in the forest and suddenly a huge wolf appeared from behind the trees. The beast slowly approached, looking at Jason with burning red eyes. He tried to run away, but his legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. The wolf came close and stood on its hind legs. Its body began to change, its fur pulling back into its skin, its limbs stretching out, taking on a human shape. It was no longer a wolf, but a huge man with a wolf's head. The creature grinned, showing sharp fangs, and stepped toward Jason. Jason woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding furiously. He realized that his encounter with the werewolf in the woods had been more than a hallucination. It had been the beginning of something terrible. From that day on, Jason began to notice strange changes in himself. His appetite increased, and at night he woke up with an eerie sense of unease. One day, looking out the window, Jason saw the full moon, and at that moment his body began to change. His bones crunched and his muscles grew larger, covered with thick fur. The young man fell to all fours, feeling his face stretch and his jaws lengthen. The transformation was horrible and painful. A few minutes later, a huge werewolf stood in Jason's place. The creature let out a blood-chilling howl and ran out of the house, heading into the dark forest. From that night on, Jason Willis became cursed, doomed to eternal nightly torment, turning into a monstrous werewolf under the full moon. His life became an endless nightmare of fear, pain, and loneliness. He was forced to hide from people for fear of harming them in his animal form. So Jason Willis became a victim of an ancient curse, forever doomed to the fate of a bloodthirsty werewolf.